And now I'd like to share with you guys a concept called conditional love, which is one of the most common things that plagues people who feel depressed but don't necessarily have a clinical illness. So if we go back to our features of cognitive depression, remember that there are particular thoughts and feelings which can be very common in our mind, very persistent in our mind, that aren't necessarily a sign of illness, but are essentially samskars, or balls of undigested emotion that kind of linger in our mind and populate it with thoughts. And if we go back to negative self-attitude, we can recall that negative self-attitude is composed of three primary feelings. One is a sense of worthlessness, one is a sense of powerlessness, and the third is a sense of hopelessness. And for people who suffer with the samskar of conditional love, they tend to feel very, very worthless on the inside. And as I've worked with dozens of people who kind of share this perspective, that the nature of their negative self-attitude is to feel very worthless about themselves, I started to discover that there are common roots and common solutions to this problem of conditional love. It always starts in childhood, at least with conditional love. And what I see is that there are a lot of people who are taught, usually by their parents, that their worth as a human being is conditional on their performance. So whether they were, in the most drastic cases, loved or not loved by their parents was very conditional. What they experienced was the very opposite of unconditional love, that their parents would sometimes shower them with praise and sometimes, brag about their kids to all of their friends, but that those same parents would sometimes be very, very disappointed in them or even ashamed of them in some drastic cases. And so what these kids grew up realizing and learning is that my value as a human being depends on how I perform. And that, in a sense, makes sense, right? Because if we think about, positive reinforcement and how kids are taught, we want to teach all kids to a certain degree that some things are good and some things are bad. That my approval of a child does absolutely have to do with their behavior. We want to reward some behavior and we want to discourage other behavior. But usually in a healthy parenting relationship, underlying that behavioral reinforcement is sort of a complete sense of unconditional acceptance. That no matter how bad you behave, I still think that you have intrinsic value as a human being. But when I work with people that suffer from the problem of conditional love, what I inevitably find is that early on in life, they encountered some kind of experience. Either it was every day at home, or sometimes it's a little bit more isolated, it's a little bit more intense, it's a little bit more traumatic, where they learned through and through that my value as a human being depends on what I do. And that too, like I said, kind of makes sense. But then what we run into is a potential problem. And this is usually why they wind up in my office in the first place, is that if my value depends on my performance as a human being, and I mess up, then what do I think about myself? I think very lowly of myself. And then it's really, really hard to try again, right? Because normally when our chips are down, when things aren't going our way, that's when we need to dig deep and work twice as hard to make up for it. But for people with the problem of conditional love, anytime they make a mistake, their internal sense of self kind of comes crumbling down. And once their internal sense of self comes crumbling down, it's very hard for them to fix things, because instead of relying on yourself, instead of having faith in yourself, you lose faith in yourself. And once you lose faith in yourself, you can't actually fix the problem. And if you can't fix the problem, your performance gets even worse. And the worse that your performance gets, the less confident you feel about yourself, the worse you feel about yourself. And then you get trapped in this vicious cycle of I screwed up, so I'm worthless. And because I'm worthless, I can't do anything. So I'm screwing up even harder. I'm screwing up even faster. I'm screwing up even longer. We'll see this in situations where kids will sometimes, drop out of high school or drop out of college or won't find a great job after college. And it can really be very little that starts this vicious cycle going. But once people get wrapped into it, it can be really hard to break out. So how do you know if you kind of fall into this camp? On the one hand, if what I'm talking about actually makes sense to you, then that's fantastic in the sense that we're going to teach you how to fix it. Not fantastic because you feel this way. But there are a couple of simple questions that I'll ask people. The first is your worth dependent on your performance? As a human being, do you think you have intrinsic value that is outside of what you do? And if you do believe you have intrinsic value, and be really honest with yourself, because we all want to believe that all human beings are valuable, but oftentimes people with the problem of conditional love, they'll give other humans the benefit of the doubt, and you'll be able to say, oh yeah, that person over there has intrinsic value as a human being. But their mind tells themselves that I suck because I wasn't able to perform. So that's kind of the first screening question that I'll ask. And then I'll also dig into other questions when I work with these people, like what was your upbringing like? When we really approach the problem of conditional love, what we find is that there's a very common upbringing experience. And this is sort of characterized by the classic tiger parent. So some people, when they grow up, have parents who really think about their children as trophies. And so if the child does a really good job, they'll kind of brag to all of their friends about how awesome you are, but they'll really, really be upset with you or ashamed of you if you don't perform. And we definitely see this. I certainly grew up with this, where my parents kind of always emphasized that my value as a human being sort of depends on whether I become a doctor or not. I still remember like it was yesterday, a conversation I had with my dad where I was 9 years old, and he said to me and my brother that one of y'all is gonna be a doctor and one of y'all is gonna be a lawyer. And so years later, when I actually found myself in medical school interviews, they always ask you this question when you're applying to medical school and you're interviewing, why do you wanna be a doctor? And then I'd share the story with them, and I'd laugh and I'd say, well, when I was 9 years old, my dad told me that one of y'all is gonna be a doctor and one of y'all is gonna be a lawyer. And my brother was older, so he got to choose first, and he went to law school. And so here I am. And then we'd all laugh, we'd go, ha ha ha, that's so funny. And then I wouldn't actually answer the question, and we'd just kind of skirt right past the topic. So when it comes to problems of conditional love, we oftentimes see this pattern, that there are definitely certain ethnicities. I know in South Asian culture, we really rank social status by what your profession is. But that's definitely not something that's restricted to South Asian culture. We definitely see it in basically all cultures. But there are some parents, some, particular social groups in which this kind of your value as a human being depends on whether you're a doctor, depends on whether you go to Harvard. Oh my goodness, right? And so we'll kind of see this pattern over and over and over again. And we also see this pattern in gifted kids. So these are kids that their parents are super proud of because, oh, my child is so smart, he's in the top of his class, he's so capable, he's so precocious, he skipped a grade. And so these kids start to learn that my value as a human being depends on me being smart. And what we see with gifted kids is very similar to the problem of conditional love, where the second they have a problem, they start to feel like they're not gifted. But their entire identity has built up around being gifted. And so when one problem happens, it becomes a vicious cycle, and they wind up being stuck. So if you're trying to think about, do you fall into this category or not, I encourage you to really look at your upbringing. How were you treated by your parents? What were you taught matters in life? When you received praise, did you receive praise when you did a good job only and got punishments when you did a bad job? Or was there an undercurrent of like, no matter how hard you mess up, we're gonna love you anyway? And the sad truth is that a lot of people didn't really grow up with this. And so what they're left with is this samskar, this thing in their mind that kind of lives in their subconscious and then populates their conscious mind with these kinds of thoughts that goes on telling them, you're worthless because you didn't do a good job. You're worthless because you didn't wind up going to this college. And you're not really a good person because these other people are better than you. And if you struggle with this, this is what we call a samskar. The good news is that in the same way that your mind was taught to believe these things, and it's almost like this automatic thought generating machine in your mind where it just pumps those thoughts into your conscious mind. The good news is that you can unlearn it, right? There are some techniques that you can do to go back, kind of almost back in time and digest some of those traumatic experiences where you learned that your value as a human being depends entirely on your performance. And the good news is that as you go through those experiences and as you digest those, then the problem of conditional love starts to shrink. Those kinds of thoughts stop bubbling up into your head. And as those thoughts stop bubbling into your head, you find that you're able to take action more easily, that you don't actually have to be the best. The most important thing is that you do something and you take one step forward. And the second thing that we want to touch on to solve this problem is, in addition to digesting the samskar, there are actually things that you can do to help develop a healthy sense of identity. So there are some things that we cover in some of these modules about developing a healthy sense of self. And if you suffer from any of these samskars, one thing we can do is digest the samskar. The other thing that we can do is sort of focus on building a healthy identity of yourself, where you can learn to unconditionally love yourself. Because if we really look at the samskar of conditional love, what you're doing is echoing what you were taught, right? Your mind is telling you that you don't have intrinsic worth as a human being because your performance is not very good. And so our approach to dealing with the problem of conditional love is, first of all, if you feel this way, there's absolutely hope. And I'm telling you, I've seen this pattern so much, which on the one hand is terrible, but on the other hand is actually really awesome, because now we've figured out a way to deal with it. And you can actually conquer this thing and not only digest those negative emotions, but start to build an identity of yourself that is actually positive and supports you and buffers you and helps you feel resilient when things don't go your way. The beginning is always so hard. Okay.
Can I do the lines?
I don't think they're going to help, but you can try.
The problem of conditional love is an unfortunately common cause of depressive feelings.
It's actually a good line.